A poor woman said to a paralyzed millionaire, "Give me your leftovers and I'll make you walk again." Minutes later, what happened to the millionaire changed everything. The sun was shining intensely on that busy afternoon when Richard Mitchell was driving his imported car down the city's main avenue. At 58, the millionaire businessman who owned a chain of famous restaurants was at the peak of his career, with a still robust body and grey hair that gave him a distinguished air. At that moment, he was holding his cell phone with one hand while the other controlled the steering wheel, completely absorbed in the conversation that would seal another $1 million deal to expand his gastronomic empire. Euphoria took over his chest as he heard the confirmation of the deal he had been negotiating for months. "It's settled then. We'll sign the contracts tomorrow morning, and in 6 months we'll have 10 more restaurants operating," he said with a voice overflowing with satisfaction. The intersection ahead was full of vehicles and pedestrians crossing in all directions, but Richard paid no attention to anything beyond the numbers dancing in his mind. His brown eyes, normally attentive to every detail around him, were glazed over the windshield without really seeing what was happening on the street. The traffic light had changed to red a few seconds ago, but he continued accelerating, completely oblivious to the imminent danger approaching. A bus full of passengers was coming down the cross street at regular speed, with the driver confident that he had the right-of-way guaranteed by the green light. Yes, I'll supervise the renovation of the first locations myself," Richard continued on the phone, without noticing the disaster about to happen. The side impact was so quick that the millionaire had no time to process what was happening. When they heard the collision, all nearby pedestrians instantly stopped. The bus hit the side of Richard's car with full force, sending the vehicle spinning uncontrollably across the hot asphalt. The phone flew from his hand, while his body was thrown against the seatbelt with such brutality that he felt the air completely escape from his lungs. The car flipped once, twice, 3 times, before finally stopping upside down in the middle of the avenue, with shattered glass scattered everywhere and metal crumpled like paper. "Help, someone help me, please," shouted Richard with a voice hoarse from the impact. The crowd began to form quickly around the accident, but instead of rushing to help, most people pulled out their cell phones and began filming the scene. Richard could see through the broken pieces of glass. Dozens of devices pointed in his direction, recording his most vulnerable moment as if it were just another spectacle. He tried to move, but after a few seconds, something much more terrifying happened. "My legs, I felt them for a moment, but now I can't feel anything," he muttered, trying to control the growing panic. The bus driver ran down from his vehicle, his face as pale as wax as he approached the wreckage. He was a middle-aged man who was visibly trembling at the sight of the completely destroyed luxury car. He knelt near the broken window, trying to see if Richard was still conscious, and was relieved to notice that the businessman kept his eyes open, despite the evident shock on his face. The bus passengers also began to get off, some slightly injured by the impact, but most just frightened by the violence of the accident. "Sir, stay calm, we've already called an ambulance. They should arrive at any moment," said the driver with a trembling voice, trying to comfort Richard. Richard was trying to maintain lucidity, despite the despair taking over his mind, as he realized he couldn't feel absolutely anything below his waist. His arms still responded to commands, and he used them to try to support himself and get a better view of his situation, but the seatbelt and the inverted position of the car made any movement extremely difficult. The smell of gasoline began to grow stronger, mixed with the odor of burnt rubber and hot metal, creating a suffocating atmosphere inside the destroyed vehicle. He could hear people around commenting on the accident, some blaming the bus driver, others saying they saw the car run the red light. "It doesn't matter whose fault it is now. I just want to get out of here and find out what happened to my legs," he thought as he fought against panic. The ambulance sirens finally cut through the hot afternoon air, bringing some relief to Richard, who was beginning to feel his vision darkening at the edges. 2 experienced paramedics jumped from the vehicle before it even came to a complete stop, carrying their equipment bags and running toward the wreckage. They quickly assessed the situation, noting the complexity of the rescue they had ahead. One of them, a young man in an impeccable uniform, laid down on the hot asphalt to speak with Richard through the broken window. "Sir, my name is Charles and I'll be taking care of you now. I need you to tell me exactly what you're feeling," said the paramedic with a calm, professional voice. Richard tried to focus to answer the paramedics' questions, but his mind was divided between growing fear and the need to understand what was happening to his body. He explained about the loss of feeling in his legs, about the initial pain that had completely disappeared, and about the pressure he felt in his chest from being upside down. The other paramedic was already coordinating with the firefighters who had just arrived, explaining what they would need to do to remove the millionaire without causing damage. When they finally managed to create a sufficient opening in the twisted metal, the paramedics and firefighters worked together to remove Richard with extreme care. They moved him millimeter by millimeter, keeping his spine perfectly aligned while transferring him to the rigid stretcher. Richard could see the blue sky for the first time since the accident, but the beauty of the sunny day cruelly contrasted with the terror he felt. He tried once more to move his legs, mentally ordering them to respond, but nothing happened, as if the lower part of his body simply no longer existed. "I still can't feel my legs. Is that normal after an accident like this?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. The younger paramedic exchanged a quick glance with his partner before responding, choosing his words carefully so as not to further alarm the patient. They knew from experience that spinal injuries could have devastating consequences, but they also knew that only detailed examinations could confirm the real extent of the damage. As they placed him in the ambulance, Richard noticed they were taking extra precautions, completely immobilizing his body and connecting various monitors to track his vital functions. The interior of the ambulance was white and sterile, a stark contrast to the chaos and dirt of the accident scene. "We're going to the best hospital in the city, Mr. Mitchell. They have the best trauma specialists," said the paramedic, trying to convey confidence. During the journey to the hospital, Richard kept his eyes fixed on the ceiling of the ambulance, trying to process how his life had completely changed in a matter of seconds. He thought about all the plans he had made for the future, the business expansions, the trips he intended to take, and wondered if any of this would still be possible. The paramedic beside him continued monitoring his signs and asking questions to keep him conscious, but Richard could barely focus on the answers. The ambulance siren cut through the city traffic, and he could feel the vehicle making sharp turns to reach the destination faster. "How many cases like mine have you seen? How many managed to walk again?" he asked, fearing the answer but needing to know. The private hospital appeared imposingly through the rear windows of the ambulance, a modern glass and steel building that Richard knew well as one of the investors. He had contributed generously to the construction of the new traumatology wing, never imagining that one day he would be a patient there. The medical team was already waiting at the emergency entrance, alerted by the paramedics about the severity of the case and the patient's identity. Richard was quickly transferred to a hospital stretcher and taken straight to the examination room, where a veritable task force of doctors and nurses awaited him. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Dr. Anderson. We'll do all the necessary tests to understand your condition," said the chief physician in a professional voice. The battery of tests began immediately, with Richard undergoing CT scans, MRIs, and a series of neurological tests. He observed the doctors' faces as they analyzed the images on their screens, looking for any sign of hope in their carefully neutral expressions. The machines around him emitted constant sounds, beeps and buzzes, that created a hospital symphony he had never noticed during his previous visits as an investor. Each test seemed to confirm his worst fears, especially when doctors asked him to try to move his legs, and nothing happened, not even a small tremor. "Doctor, be honest with me. What's the real situation?" asked Richard, his normally commanding voice now reduced to a vulnerable whisper. The hours dragged on as more specialists were called to evaluate the case, each bringing their specific expertise but reaching the same concerning conclusions. Richard noticed when the doctors began to whisper among themselves in the corners of the room, casting concerned glances in his direction before returning to their technical discussions. He knew this type of behavior from the business world. It was what happened when someone had to give bad news to an important client. The nurse at his side tried to keep him comfortable, adjusting the pillows and checking the monitors, but he could see the compassion in her eyes, the kind of look reserved for hopeless cases. "I want to know what happened to me. I need a diagnosis." "Will I walk again?" he asked, feeling dread about the doctor's response. The chief neurologist finally approached, a white-haired man with a grave expression whom Richard recognized as one of the best specialists in the country. He carried a folder with the test results, and the way he held it as if it were a terrible weight already said much about its contents. The other doctors positioned themselves around, forming a professional semicircle that seemed more like a wall of bad news. Richard took a deep breath, mentally preparing himself to hear what he had already suspected since the moment he lost feeling in his legs. "Mr. Mitchell, we've analyzed all the tests and we need to talk about your condition." The neurologist began with a measured, careful voice. The doctor began to explain using terms that tried to be simple but carried the weight of a sentence. He showed the images of Richard's spine, pointing to the specific vertebrae that had been affected by the impact. The injury was located between the 12th thoracic and 1st lumbar vertebrae, a critical area for controlling leg movements. The images clearly showed the damage, a complete rupture that had interrupted communication between the brain and the lower body. Richard heard each word as if they were being hammered into his mind, each explanation destroying another piece of hope. "But is there any treatment, any experimental surgery that could reverse this?" he asked, clinging to any possibility. The neurologist slowly shook his head, the most painful movement Richard had ever witnessed. He explained that medicine had advanced greatly, but complete spinal cord injuries like Richard's were still beyond the current capacity to repair. There was no surgery in the world that could reconnect completely severed nerves, no treatment that could reverse the damage already done. The paralysis was irreversible, a reality that Richard would have to accept and learn to live with. The other doctors remained silent, some looking at the floor, others maintaining professional but compassionate eye contact. "Mr. Mitchell, the injury was complete. The paralysis is irreversible. No surgery in the world can reverse this." "I'm sorry, but you will not walk again," said the neurologist with devastating finality. Richard felt the world collapse around him with those words, as if the accident were happening again, but this time in slow motion and infinitely. He looked at his motionless legs under the hospital sheet, limbs that had been part of him for 58 years and were now just dead weight. Denial emerged as an immediate defense mechanism, his mind refusing to accept that the man who had built an empire, who had always been in control of everything, now couldn't even control his own body. He gripped the arms of the gurney tightly, as if through sheer will he could force his legs to respond. "You're wrong. There has to be a way," he shouted with desperation and anger mixed in his voice. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in the hospital, and life had taken completely different directions for people who still didn't know each other. In a humble house on the outskirts of the city, Sarah Coleman woke up once again before sunrise, her thin and tired body protesting against another day of endless worries. At 35, the neurologist who once had a promising career now found herself reduced to caring for her sick mother at home, without resources and without hope of recovering her former life. Her brown hair, once always well-groomed, was now tied in a messy bun, and her skilled hands that had once saved so many lives trembled slightly while preparing the thin morning coffee. "One more day, Sarah. You can get through one more day," she murmured to herself, trying to find strength. The house where they lived was a simple 3-room construction, with walls that urgently needed a new coat of paint and furniture that had known better days. Sarah moved silently through the small kitchen, trying not to wake her mother, who was sleeping in the only bedroom of the house. Margaret Coleman, at 54 years old, had been a strong and hard-working woman throughout her life, but now heart disease had transformed her into someone fragile and dependent. Sarah opened the improvised medicine cabinet on a kitchen shelf, and her heart sank when she saw that only 2 doses remained of the essential heart medication that kept her mother stable. "How am I going to afford more when I don't even have money for bread?" she thought as she carefully closed the cabinet. 8 months had passed since Sarah was fired from the hospital where she worked, a dismissal disguised as cost-cutting, but everyone knew it was retaliation for her reporting the corruption scheme in medication purchases. She had done the right thing, had followed her medical oath to protect patients, but the price was her career and financial stability. Since then, no hospital or clinic in the city would hire her. Her name had been tarnished by the powerful people she had confronted. The savings she had were depleted month after month with Margaret's care, Until now, absolutely nothing remained. Maybe today someone will respond to my resumes. Maybe today will be different, she said, looking at the pile of unpaid bills on the table. Sarah took the glass jar where she kept her last coins and poured the contents onto the kitchen table, the metallic sound echoing in the morning silence. She carefully counted every cent, separating the coins by value and mentally calculating to see if she could buy at least one more dose of medicine. Her fingers moved the coins from one side to another, as if reorganizing them could magically increase their value. But mathematics was relentless and cruel. After counting 3 times, reality imposed itself. She had only enough to buy food for one day or medicine for one day, but not both. Why does life have to be so difficult when all I did was try to help people? She questioned as tears began to form in her eyes. The sound of slow footsteps in the hallway announced that Margaret had awakened, and Sarah quickly wiped away her tears and put the coins back in the jar. Her mother appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face still marked by sleep, but already showing concern upon seeing her daughter's expression. Margaret was a woman who maintained her dignity despite difficulties, her grey hair always carefully combed, and her simple clothes always clean and well-ironed. She approached slowly, hand against the wall for balance, and sat in the chair opposite her daughter. "Daughter, I know you're worried about money for my medicine. I see the same expression on your face every day," she said in a soft but firm voice. Sarah tried to hide her concern, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and serving a cup of coffee to her mother. She knew Margaret felt guilty for being a burden, a word Sarah would never use, but which her mother constantly repeated in her moments of discouragement. The truth was that Sarah would make any sacrifice for her mother, the woman who raised her alone, who worked 3 jobs to pay for her medical school, who always believed in her even when the world seemed against her. The 2 women looked at each other in silence for a few moments, an entire conversation happening without words, years of mutual love and sacrifice creating a communication that transcended speech. "Mom, everything's fine, we'll find a way like we always do," Sarah lied, trying to sound convincing. Margaret extended her hand across the table and held her daughter's hand, immediately noticing the tremor Sarah was trying to hide. A mother's experienced eyes scanned her daughter's face, noticing the deep dark circles, the excessive thinness, the evident signs of stress and deprivation. She knew Sarah wasn't eating properly to save food, knew her daughter had sold everything of value to pay for her medicine, knew each day was a losing battle against growing poverty. With a decisive movement, Margaret removed from her finger the only object of value she still possessed, her simple wedding ring that carried decades of history. "Daughter, sell my wedding ring. It must be worth something to buy your medicines," she said, extending the jewel to Sarah. Sarah looked at the ring in her mother's outstretched hand and felt her heart break into 1,000 pieces. That ring was the only memento Margaret had of her marriage, the only physical connection to a past she rarely mentioned, but that Sarah knew was important to her. The simple gold band was worn by the years, but still shone with the dignity of someone who had been loved and cared for decades. Sarah gently closed her mother's hand over the ring, refusing to accept that final sacrifice. "I sold everything, Mom, even my medical instruments. The ring won't make any difference now," she finally confessed, the words coming out like a surrender. Shock passed over Margaret's face like a wave, her eyes widening as she understood the depth of the situation they were in. Sarah's medical instruments were her pride, tools she had bought with her first salary as a doctor, carefully chosen and maintained with professional zeal. If she had sold even those, it meant they had reached rock bottom, that there was nothing left between them and complete destitution. Margaret rose abruptly from her chair, emotion giving her sudden energy, and walked to her daughter to embrace her. "My daughter, my poor daughter, what have I done to your life?" she lamented as she held Sarah against her chest. It was in this moment of emotional embrace that everything changed drastically. Margaret suddenly clutched her chest tightly, her face contorting into an expression of intense pain that Sarah recognized immediately. Years of medical training took over instantly, and she held her mother before she fell, carefully guiding her back to the chair. Margaret's face was rapidly growing pale, cold sweat beginning to form on her forehead, and her breathing was becoming increasingly labored and shallow. "Sarah, I can't. Breathe," Margaret gasped, her hand still clutching her chest as if she could relieve the pain with pressure. Sarah entered doctor mode immediately, her fingers seeking her mother's pulse at the neck while observing her other vital signs. The pulse was irregular and weak, the skin becoming increasingly cold and clammy, all the classic signs of an acute myocardial infarction. She ran to the medicine cabinet, but knew she had nothing that could help in that emergency situation. No aspirin, no nitroglycerin, nor any other medication that could make a difference in those critical minutes. Her hands frantically searched for the old telephone hanging on the wall, dialing the emergency number with fingers that now trembled, not from hunger, but from pure terror. "I need an ambulance. My mother is having a heart attack," she shouted as soon as someone answered. The voice on the other end was bureaucratic and disinterested, asking routine questions while Margaret struggled to breathe in the chair nearby. Sarah responded quickly, her eyes never leaving her mother, observing every change in her deteriorating condition with each passing second. When they finally came to the question of payment, Sarah felt her blood freeze in her veins at the cold, calculated response from the operator. The private ambulance would cost for transport, or she could wait 3 hours for the public ambulance that was attending other emergencies. "Ma'am, we need the amount in cash for the ambulance dispatch or wait 3 hours," repeated the emotionless voice on the other end. Sarah slammed the phone down, knowing she didn't even have a single bill, just coins, let alone the cost of transport, and that 3 hours would be too late for her mother. She ran back to Margaret, who was now semi-conscious, her lips beginning to take on a bluish coloration indicating lack of oxygenation. Sarah carefully laid her on the kitchen floor, positioning her correctly to begin the first aid procedures she knew so well. Her hands positioned themselves on her mother's chest, and she began cardiac compressions, with the precision of years of experience, mentally counting each compression while alternating with mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. "Don't leave me, Mom, please hang in there," she begged between compressions. Margaret opened her eyes briefly during a pause in compressions, her consciousness fighting against the darkness that threatened to engulf her completely. Her gaze met Sarah's, and there was something urgent in her expression, something she desperately needed to communicate before it was too late. With tremendous effort, she raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the bedroom, her lips moving to form words that Sarah had to lean in to hear. Margaret's voice was just a hoarse whisper, but the words were clear and laden with importance. "Daughter, in my diary, the truth about your father," she said before losing consciousness completely. Sarah had no time to process those mysterious words, as Margaret's body went completely limp, and she could no longer detect any pulse. Panic took over, but medical training kept her movements precise and efficient as she continued cardiac compressions with even more vigor. She knew that every second counted, that her mother's brain would begin to suffer irreversible damage if it went too long without oxygen. The small house seemed even smaller now, the walls closing in on her as she struggled alone to save the life of the most important person in her world. "Breathe, Mum! Breathe for me!" she shouted as she blew air into Margaret's lungs. After endless minutes of resuscitation, Sarah realized she needed urgent help and that staying there alone would mean certain death for her mother. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she lifted Margaret's inert body in her arms, the weight making each step a battle. She staggered through the house, hitting the door with her shoulder to open it, and went out into the street carrying her mother like a child carries a broken doll. The morning sun was beginning to heat the asphalt, and some people were already moving about the street, stopping to observe the dramatic scene. "Help! Someone help me, please!" Sarah cried with desperation in her voice. People on the street stopped to watch, but instead of rushing to help, most of them took out their phones and began filming the scene. Sarah couldn't believe the coldness and lack of empathy she was witnessing. People more concerned with getting content for their social media than helping someone in clear need of assistance. She continued walking with Margaret in her arms, her muscles burning with the effort, desperately looking for any vehicle that could take them to the hospital. A taxi finally appeared at the corner, and Sarah ran towards it, almost stumbling under her mother's weight. "Hospital, please, it's an emergency," she begged the driver through the window. The taxi driver was a middle-aged man who looked at Sarah and then at the unconscious Margaret in her arms, his face immediately closing in an expression of refusal. He could see that the older woman was in serious condition, her bluish lips and complete lack of response, indicating she might already be dead. The fear of trouble, of having to explain to the police why there was a dead person in his car, spoke louder than any sense of humanity. He shook his head negatively and began to close the vehicle's window. "Ma'am, she's dying. I don't want trouble. Find an ambulance," he said before accelerating and disappearing down the street. Sarah stood in the middle of the street, watching the taxi drive away, disbelief and despair fighting for space in her exhausted mind. She gently laid Margaret on the hot asphalt, not caring about the dirt or what people would think, and immediately resumed chest compressions. Her hands rhythmically pressed her mother's chest, manually pumping the blood that the stopped heart could no longer circulate. Around her, a circle of onlookers formed, all with their phones raised, recording every moment of that human drama as if it were a spectacle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. "Come on, Mum. Come back to me." Sarah counted aloud while maintaining the rhythm of compressions. The sun was rising in the sky, and the asphalt was getting hotter under Sarah's knees, who tirelessly continued her resuscitation work. Her old lab coat was soaked with sweat, her arms trembling from exhaustion, but she couldn't stop, not while there was the slightest chance of bringing her mother back. Some people in the circle of observers commented among themselves, some saying she should give up, that it was obvious the woman was already dead, others admiring her determination. No one, however, offered real help. No one offered to take turns with compressions or to call for help. "Someone please call an ambulance. I don't have money, but please," Sarah begged without stopping compressions. The compressions continued in a hypnotic rhythm. 30 compressions followed by 2 rescue breaths, a cycle that Sarah could do in her sleep after years of practice in hospitals. But doing this on her own mother, in the middle of a dirty street, under the scorching sun and the indifferent gazes of strangers, was a torture that transcended the physical. Each compression was accompanied by a silent prayer. Each rescue breath was a desperate plea to the universe not to take her mother. Margaret's body remained inert, with no response to her daughter's Herculean efforts. "This is not how our story ends, Mom. Not after everything we've been through together," Sarah declared with renewed determination. An elderly gentleman finally separated from the crowd of onlookers and knelt beside Sarah, his calloused hands gently touching her shoulder. He had seen many things in his long life, but the dedication of that daughter trying to save her mother touched him deeply. He took off his worn jacket and placed it under Margaret's head, creating an improvised support, and then looked into Sarah's eyes with genuine compassion. Without saying a word, he picked up his old phone and dialed a number, speaking quickly to someone on the other end. "My nephew has a car. He's coming. Just hold on a little longer, miss," he said, in a voice made hoarse by age. Sarah continued the compressions with renewed energy, from the hope that she would finally be able to get her mother to the hospital. Her fingers periodically checked Margaret's pulse, looking for any sign that her heart had started beating on its own again, but nothing happened. Time seemed to drag at a torturous pace, each second an eternity, as she fought against death that was trying to claim her mother. The crowd around had grown even larger, some people now live-streaming the dramatic scene, narrating the events as if they were reporters. "It's been 15 minutes of CPR. Is there still hope?" someone in the crowd asked loudly. The sound of tires braking sharply cut through the crowd's murmur, and an old but well-maintained car stopped next to where Sarah continued her compressions. A young man jumped out of the vehicle, running to help without hesitation, and together with the elderly gentleman and Sarah, they carefully lifted Margaret and placed her in the back seat. Sarah immediately got in, positioning her mother's head on her lap and preparing to continue compressions during the journey. The car sped off toward the hospital, leaving behind the crowd that slowly dispersed, already looking for the next drama to record. "Hang on, Mum, we're almost at the hospital, just hang on a little longer," whispered Sarah as the car accelerated through the streets. The old car sped through the narrow neighborhood streets, the engine protesting with each abrupt gear change as the young driver dodged potholes and obstacles along the way. Sarah kept Margaret lying on the back seat, her body contorted in an uncomfortable position, to continue cardiac compressions even within the tight space of the vehicle. Each jolt of the car made the task even more difficult, but she couldn't stop. Each second without blood circulation exponentially increased the risk of irreversible brain damage. The elderly gentleman had squeezed into the front seat and constantly turned backward, his worried eyes alternating between Sarah and Margaret's pale face. "Stay strong, miss. The hospital is 10 minutes from here if my nephew can get through traffic," he said, trying to offer some comfort. The young man at the wheel drove with a mixture of urgency and care, honking to alert other vehicles, while overtaking through the most improbable spaces. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white from tension, and drops of sweat ran down his face despite the wind coming through the open windows. He constantly looked in the rearview mirror, following Sarah's tireless work and measuring the severity of the situation by her increasingly desperate expression. Traffic began to thicken as they approached downtown, and he had to partially drive onto the sidewalk to bypass a traffic jam, pedestrians jumping aside and shouting indignantly. "Sorry, uncle, but we can't stop now. Every second counts," he explained to the elderly gentleman who was holding firmly onto the dashboard. Sarah felt her arms burning as if they were on fire, her muscles protesting against the continuous and repetitive effort of compressions. She had lost count of how many cycles she had completed, her mind focused only on maintaining the correct rhythm and proper depth of each compression. Sweat ran down her face and dripped onto her mother's inert face, mixing with the tears she could no longer hold back. Between compressions, she quickly checked Margaret's airways and blew air into her lungs, watching her chest rise and fall artificially. "Mom, I know you're still in there. Don't give up on me now, please," she begged, before resuming another cycle of compressions. The car made a sharp turn that threw everyone to the side, and Sarah had to use all her strength to keep Margaret stable while continuing the resuscitation procedure. Through the window, she could see the simple houses giving way to commercial buildings, a sign that they were approaching the hospital area. The sound of the horn was constant now, the young driver using it to clear a path among cars that seemed to multiply with each block. Some people on the sidewalk stopped to watch the car speeding by, realizing from the urgency that something serious was happening. 3 minutes, miss. 3 minutes and we'll be there," shouted the driver over the noise of the engine and the wind. A red light appeared ahead, with an intersection completely filled with vehicles crossing in both directions. The young man didn't hesitate, honked hard and slowed down just enough to maintain some control over the car while weaving between other vehicles. Furious drivers shouted and gestured, some nearly colliding with each other as they tried to avoid the speeding car. Sarah barely noticed the chaos around her, her attention completely focused on her mother, whose face was now a concerning grayish tone. She leaned forward to check Margaret's pupils, noticing they were dilated and unresponsive to the light coming through the window. "No, no, no! Hang on a little longer, Mom. We're almost there," she said, resuming compressions with renewed vigor fueled by panic. The hospital finally appeared on the horizon, its tall, imposing building promising salvation if they could arrive in time. The young driver floored the accelerator for the final sprint, the old engine roaring in protest, but responding to the urgent command. They passed through the main gate at high speed, ignoring the security booth and going straight to the emergency entrance. The security guard ran after them, shouting for them to stop, but gave up when he saw Sarah in the back seat, performing cardiac massage. The car skidded to a stop right in front of the automatic emergency doors, leaving tire marks on the asphalt. "We're here, miss, we're here. Help, someone help here," shouted the elderly man, jumping out of the car and frantically waving to the medical team. The automatic emergency doors opened with a mechanical hiss as Sarah leaped from the car, still performing compressions on Margaret's chest. 2 nurses ran toward her, pushing a hospital stretcher, their faces changing from professional to alarmed as they realized the critical condition of the patient. Sarah was reluctant to stop compressions even for a second, her arms continuing the rhythmic movement as they transferred Margaret from the car seat to the stretcher with coordinated and precise movements. The emergency corridor opened before them like a chaotic tunnel of sounds, smells, and constant movement, with dozens of other patients on stretchers lined up against the walls, some moaning in pain, others in worrying silence. "How long has she been in cardiac arrest?" asked one of the nurses as they ran down the corridor. Sarah tried to answer, while continuing to run alongside the stretcher, her wobbly legs threatening to give out at any moment after the extreme effort of the last 30 minutes. The hospital was in its usual state of overcrowding, with patients on stretchers occupying every available inch of the corridor, anguished family members clustered in small groups, and the medical team rushing back and forth trying to handle an impossible demand. The characteristic smell of disinfectant, mixed with sweat and human despair, invaded her nostrils as they maneuvered the stretcher between human and mechanical obstacles. A young doctor appeared running, his white coat already stained from other emergencies of the day, and began to assess Margaret while walking. 20 minutes of continuous cardiopulmonary resuscitation. She has a cardiac history, Sarah informed in a hoarse voice. The emergency room where they took Margaret was an improvised cubicle with curtains that barely offered privacy, the space already shared with another patient who moaned softly on the other side of the thin cloth. The medical team worked with efficiency, born of constant practice in adverse conditions, connecting Margaret to monitors, inserting venous access, and preparing the defibrillator, while Sarah observed each movement with a doctor's eyes and a daughter's heart. The cardiac monitor began to show an erratic rhythm, green lines dancing on the screen in patterns that Sarah recognized as ventricular fibrillation, a potentially fatal arrhythmia that needed immediate intervention. The young doctor applied the defibrillator paddles to Margaret's chest, the conductive gel shining under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Everyone stand back. I'm applying the shock," he warned before pressing the button. Margaret's body arched with the electrical discharge, an involuntary movement that always seemed unnatural, no matter how many times Sarah had witnessed it in her career. For a terrible moment, the monitor showed a flat line, the sharp and constant sound of the alarm filling the small space and making Sarah's heart stop along with it. Then, miraculously, one heartbeat appeared on the screen, then another and another, until an irregular but present rhythm was established. The medical team exchanged looks of cautious relief while adjusting medications and checking vital signs that slowly began to stabilize. Sarah approached the stretcher and held her mother's hand, feeling warmth slowly returning to skin that minutes before had been ice cold. "We managed to reverse it for now, but she needs urgent surgery," said the doctor, looking at Sarah with seriousness. The following hours passed in a blur of exams, forms and agonizing waiting, while Margaret underwent a battery of tests to assess the extent of the cardiac damage. Sarah remained by her side the whole time, refusing to leave even when nurses suggested she rest or eat something. 20 hours had passed since she woke up the previous morning, and exhaustion weighed on every cell of her body, but she couldn't afford to falter now. The emergency corridor where Margaret ended up being allocated was crowded beyond capacity, with stretchers lined up on both sides, creating a narrow pathway through which the medical team had to squeeze to pass. "Mom, I'm here, I won't leave your side," whispered Sarah, even knowing that Margaret was unconscious. The cardiac monitor next to Margaret's stretcher became Sarah's obsessive focus, each oscillation in the green line sending waves of panic through her exhausted body. The numbers indicating blood pressure, heart rate, and oxygen saturation constantly danced, never stabilizing at safe values for long. She observed nurses constantly adjusting the intravenous medications, increasing the dose of vasoactive drugs to maintain blood pressure at minimally acceptable levels. The endotracheal tube keeping Margaret's airways open was connected to an old mechanical ventilator that wheezed and clicked with each respiratory cycle, its rhythmic but disturbing sound competing with the constant alarms of other monitors in the crowded hallway. "The parameters are very unstable. She needs intensive care," one nurse commented to another as they passed by. The reality of the situation began to impose itself when Sarah saw the on-duty doctor approaching with a clipboard in his hands and an expression she knew very well from her years working at that same hospital. It was the expression of someone who had to deliver bad news, of someone who had to balance medical compassion with the harsh reality of the precarious healthcare system. The doctor was someone Sarah knew from previous years, when she still worked there before her controversial dismissal. He stopped in front of her, his eyes avoiding direct contact while flipping through the papers on his clipboard, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Sarah rose from the uncomfortable plastic chair where she had spent the last few hours, her legs protesting after staying in the same position for so long. "Dr. Anderson, please tell me the truth about her condition," she asked, her professional voice masking the terror she felt. The doctor finally met her eyes, and Sarah saw in them a mixture of pity and resignation that made her stomach sink even further. He explained in clinical but simplified terms that the heart attack had caused significant damage to Margaret's heart muscle, that multiple coronary arteries were blocked, and that without urgent myocardial revascularization surgery, the chances of survival were minimal. Sarah knew the procedure well, had witnessed dozens of them during her residency, knew it was the only real chance to save her mother. The doctor continued explaining that the condition was deteriorating rapidly, that the medications were only buying time, but without surgical intervention in the next 48 hours, Margaret's heart simply wouldn't hold up. "Dr. Coleman, your mother needs immediate cardiac surgery, or she won't survive 48 hours but without advance payment. Impossible," he finally said, the words falling like stones. Sarah felt the world spin around her with that statement. That amount was a fortune for someone in her situation. She didn't have enough for some medications, let alone for surgery, and they both knew this very well. Despair took hold of her as she grabbed the doctor's arm, her professional pride completely forgotten in the face of the possibility of losing her mother. Tears began to stream down her face as she begged, her voice breaking with emotion she could no longer contain. Years of medical training, of professional composure, all crumbled in that moment of pure maternal desperation. "Doctor, if I do the surgery, will you provide me with the equipment and a room? I can't pay. But you worked with me, you know I'm competent, please. I don't have money and—" "I can't let her die, let me save her," she begged, her hands trembling as she held his coat. The doctor's face hardened at her words, and Sarah saw the exact moment when he changed from compassionate colleague to system employee. He moved away from her, his eyes now cold and distant, and Sarah realized she had crossed a line by mentioning his past at the hospital. Her dismissal had been a scandal that shook the institution. Her whistleblowing on corruption had resulted in investigations, dismissals, and a complete reorganization of the administration. Many saw her as a snitch, someone who had betrayed the medical class by exposing schemes that everyone knew about but pretended not to see. The doctor looked around nervously, checking if anyone had witnessed their interaction, clearly concerned about being seen talking to her. "Sarah, you were banned from this hospital after reporting the board. If you try to use our rooms or do something stupid, I'll call security." "You don't work here anymore," he said in a harsh voice, and left her there, claiming he had another patient to attend to. Before Sarah could run after the doctor, Margaret's heart monitor began to beep frantically, the sharp sound cutting through the ambient noise of the corridor. Sarah turned immediately, her medical training overriding her emotional despair, and saw on the monitor the irregular pattern indicating severe arrhythmia. Her mother's heart was failing, the ventricles beating uncoordinatedly in a chaotic rhythm that couldn't pump blood efficiently. She rushed to the stretcher's side, her hands automatically checking Margaret's pulse at her neck, feeling the weak and irregular beats under her fingers. Nurses came running, but Sarah was already adjusting the medications, increasing the dose of amiodarone to try to control the arrhythmia. "She's in ventricular tachycardia. We need to stabilize her now," she shouted to the approaching team. The scene around was one of controlled chaos, with medical professionals running between dozens of stretchers in the corridor, each dealing with their own emergencies. Sarah could hear other monitors alarming, other patients in crisis, family members crying and begging for attention. It was a symphony of human suffering that she knew well, but that now hit her differently, no longer as a doctor observing from the outside, but as a desperate family member fighting through the system. An elderly patient on the stretcher next to her began to get terribly sick. On the other side, a pregnant woman screamed in pain, apparently in premature labor, while there were no obstetricians available to attend to her. "How can they let people suffer like this?" thought Sarah while continuing to work on her mother. Sarah began chest compressions again when Margaret's rhythm deteriorated further, her hands automatically finding the correct spot on the sternum as she applied the necessary pressure. She could feel her mother's ribs flexing under her palms, the fragile body protesting against the force needed to keep blood circulating. Other patients and family members watched the scene, some with pity, others with the indifference born of seeing daily tragedies in that place. A nurse approached to help, but was immediately called to another more critical emergency, leaving Sarah alone once more. Sweat ran down her face, dripping onto the thin sheet covering Margaret as she maintained the constant rhythm of compressions. "Don't give up, Mom, I won't let you go," she said between compressions. After endless minutes of resuscitation, Margaret's heart rhythm finally stabilized again, returning to an irregular but functional pattern. Sarah collapsed into the chair beside the stretcher, her breathing as laborious as her mother's on the ventilator. Her arms shook uncontrollably from exhaustion, and she could feel every muscle in her body protesting against the constant effort. An older nurse, with a face marked by years of working in those conditions, approached discreetly and placed her hand on Sarah's shoulder. She looked around to make sure no one was listening, before leaning in and whispering something that made Sarah's blood freeze even more. "I remember you, Doctor. I'm sorry. I heard the director say that without payment they'll disconnect the machines in 2 hours. I know you tried to report him, but now your mother's life is in the hands of those people." "You tried to denounce for doing what was right," whispered the nurse before quickly moving away. Sarah looked at the old cracked wall clock that marked time in that corridor of despair, mentally calculating how much time she had to find an impossible solution. 2 hours to get all that money, 2 hours to save her mother's life, 2 hours before the healthcare system she had tried to improve would leave her an orphan. She observed Margaret lying on the stretcher, her chest rising and falling only thanks to the mechanical ventilator, her face pale and swollen from medications, completely unaware of the drama unfolding around her. Each breath was a battle, each heartbeat a temporary victory against death lurking in the shadows of that hospital. Sarah took her mother's hand, feeling the cold, damp skin, the inert fingers that had so often caressed her face as a child. "I'll find a way, Mom, I promise," she whispered, though she had no idea how to fulfill that promise. The hallway continued its chaotic routine, with new patients constantly arriving while others were taken away, some to surgery, others to the morgue. Sarah watched everything with glazed eyes of exhaustion, her mind desperately trying to find a solution while fighting against the sleep that threatened to overcome her. She thought of all the medical colleagues she knew, but she knew that after the scandal of her dismissal, no one would risk associating with her. She thought about selling her organs, stealing, anything that could generate the necessary money, but each idea was more impossible than the last. Desperation was a physical weight on her chest, making her own breathing difficult as she watched her mother struggling for each breath. 20 years studying medicine, and I can't save my own mother, she thought bitterly. A man in a dark suit appeared in the hallway, clearly out of place in that environment of misery and despair. Sarah immediately recognized him as the hospital administrator, the same one who had orchestrated her dismissal months ago. He walked with determined steps, followed by 2 uniformed security guards, checking papers on a clipboard as he passed the lined-up stretchers. Sarah felt panic rise up her spine as she realized he was making the payment verification round, determining which patients could continue receiving treatment and which would be disconnected from the machines. She saw him stop at a stretcher 3 spaces ahead, where a family cried around an unconscious young man, begging for more time. The administrator shook his head negatively, made a note on his clipboard, and the security guards began disconnecting the machines while the family screamed in despair. "No, please, just one more day, we'll get the money," they pleaded uselessly. The administrator continued his march down the hallway, inexorably approaching Margaret's stretcher. Sarah stood up, positioning herself protectively between her mother and the approaching man. She could see the recognition in his eyes when he identified her, a small, cruel smile forming on his lips as he realized the irony of the situation. The doctor who had denounced the hospital's corruption was now at the mercy of the same system she had tried to reform. He stopped in front of her, his cold eyes scanning the scene, from unconscious Margaret on the stretcher to Sarah in her deplorable state of exhaustion and despair. The security guards positioned themselves strategically, ready to intervene if necessary. "Miss Coleman, without a deposit, we remove the machines in 1 hour. Final decision," he said, in a voice devoid of any compassion. At that exact moment, as if the universe wanted to add more cruelty to the situation, the heart monitor began to alarm again, the green lines showing the beginning of another arrhythmia. Sarah turned desperately to attend to her mother, but the administrator stopped her. The security guards stepped forward, making it clear they wouldn't allow her to interfere. Panic completely overtook Sarah, who felt tears freely flowing down her face as she watched the numbers on the monitor worsen. She rushed to the stretcher, her hands trembling as she adjusted the medications. "Save her until I get back." "I'll get the money, 1 hour, please." "If she goes, it won't be just a complaint you'll have to worry about," she shouted as she worked frantically. The administrator looked at his expensive watch, a theatrical and cruel gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Sarah. He made a note on his clipboard, the sound of the pen on paper seeming like a death sentence being signed. The other patients and family members in the hallway watched the scene in silence, some with pity, others relieved it wasn't them in the same situation. The administrator turned to leave, his expensive shoes clicking on the worn hospital floor, but stopped and looked over his shoulder with one last calculated provocation. His words were pronounced with the precision of someone who knew exactly how much power he had over life and death in that place. 59 minutes now, he coldly corrected before continuing his march down the hallway. Sarah watched the administrator walk away, her despair transforming into a fierce determination she didn't know she possessed. She looked at her mother one last time, memorizing every detail of her face, silently promising she would do anything to save her. Without thinking twice, she ran down the hallway, past surprised security guards, crowded stretchers, crying family members, toward the hospital exit. Her feet barely touched the ground as she ran, her mind already calculating the impossible options that lay ahead. The clock now marked 58 minutes, each second a lost eternity, each moment one less chance to save the only person who had always been by her side. "I'll make it, Mom, even if it's the last thing I do," she shouted as she disappeared through the hospital doors. Sarah ran through the city streets as if her life depended on it, and in a way it did, because her mother's life hung by a thread that became thinner with each passing second. Her feet hit the hot afternoon asphalt, each step sending waves of pain through her already exhausted legs, but she couldn't stop, not when the clock was mercilessly counting down to the moment they would turn off the machines keeping Margaret alive. She had tried calling every acquaintance she still had, but one after another, the calls fell into emptiness or were rejected as soon as they identified who was calling. Her destroyed reputation preceded her like an evil shadow, closing all doors before she could even knock. The scorching afternoon sun made sweat run down her face, already stained with dried tears, creating trails of desperation on her skin. The streets of the commercial district were busy with people coming and going about their normal lives, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding in Sarah's life. She passed banks where she had no credit, pawn shops where she had already sold everything of value, offices of loan sharks she knew would collect with her life if she couldn't pay. Each corner she turned was another destroyed hope. Each familiar face she saw in the crowd looked away when they recognized her. The hunger that had accompanied her for 3 days now roared in her stomach like a wild beast, occasionally making her vision blur and her legs wobble even more. She stopped for a moment, leaning against a lamppost, trying to catch her breath and clear her mind that was beginning to fail under the weight of stress and deprivation. "I can't go on. So I'm weak. I won't be able to run anymore, and if I can't be fast enough, how will I manage to at least try to raise the necessary amount in so little time?" she asked herself, looking at the clock of a nearby store. It was then that the aroma hit her like a punch to her empty stomach, the unmistakable smell of high-quality food coming from the most luxurious restaurant in the city, the Mitchell Gold. Sarah knew that days without eating properly were taking their toll. Without adequate nourishment, she would hardly be able to walk a few more streets to the next bank. She knew that restaurant by name, knew it was frequented by the city's elite, where a single dish cost more than she spent on food in an entire month when she still had a job. The aroma of grilled meats, exotic spices, and fresh bread floated in the air like exquisite torture for someone who hadn't eaten in days. She stopped in front of the imposing facade of the restaurant, watching through the smoked glass windows, the elegant customers savoring their meals unhurriedly, without worry, not knowing that each forkful they brought to their mouths was worth more than her mother's life at that moment. Her own reflection in the glass shocked her, disheveled hair, wrinkled clothes, face marked by exhaustion and despair. "I can't go in like this. They'll throw me out immediately," she thought, but hunger and desperation spoke louder. The glass doors of the restaurant opened automatically as Sarah approached, releasing a wave of air conditioning that made her shiver after the scorching heat of the street. The interior was even more opulent than she had imagined, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling, tables covered with impeccable white linen tablecloths, and expensive artwork decorating the walls. The soft sound of classical music floated in the environment, mixed with the discreet tinkling of silver cutlery and the polite murmur of conversations. Sarah took a few hesitant steps inside, immediately conscious of how she stood out in that environment, like a stain of reality on a canvas of fantasy. A waiter in an impeccable uniform intercepted her before she could take a few more steps, his face professional but clearly uncomfortable with her presence. "Ma'am, do you have a reservation?" he asked with forced politeness, already knowing the answer. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but the words died in her throat when she saw a waiter passing by with a tray full of practically untouched plates being taken back to the kitchen. Perfectly good food that would be thrown in the trash simply because wealthy customers hadn't finished their generous portions. The contrast between the casual waste and her own desperate hunger was almost too painful to bear. She swallowed what pride she had left, the last vestige of dignity that had survived months of humiliation and deprivation. Her voice came out weak and trembling, barely audible over the ambient music and polite murmurs. "No, Please, can I have the leftovers? I'm hungry," she begged, each word a stab to her pride as a doctor who had once dined in places like this. The waiter's face changed from discomfort to something between pity and disgust, clearly not knowing how to handle the situation. Other customers began to notice the scene, some whispering among themselves, others watching with morbid curiosity. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes on her, judging, condemning, some even enjoying her embarrassment. It was at this moment that a strong, authoritative voice cut through the growing awkwardness coming from a table near the window. Richard Mitchell was sitting in his special wheelchair, observing the scene with eyes that had seen their own share of humiliation and despair in recent months. Something in Sarah's posture, in the way she kept her head high despite the humiliation, in the dignified desperation in her eyes, touched something deep in him. "Waiter, let her in." "Sit here, miss," he ordered with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Sarah looked surprised at the man in the wheelchair, not believing what she had heard. Richard was clearly someone important. His expensive clothes and the waiter's immediate deference made that clear. She hesitated for a moment, torn between the relief of having found some kindness and the embarrassment of accepting charity. But hunger and desperation overcame any remnant of pride, and she slowly walked to the indicated table, her legs trembling not just from weakness, but also from emotion. The chair was more comfortable than anything she had sat on in months, the soft upholstery seeming to embrace her. Richard observed her with genuine curiosity, noticing the details that told a story of downfall and despair. The doctor's hands now trembling from hunger, the intelligent eyes now clouded by exhaustion. "Order whatever you want," he said gently, pushing the menu toward her. Sarah looked at the menu with its absurd prices, each dish costing more than she had spent on food in the entire last month. Her hands were shaking so much, she could barely hold the fine leather menu, and the elegant letters danced before her eyes, blurred by hunger and exhaustion. She knew she couldn't accept such generosity, that she had already humiliated herself enough by asking for leftovers, that accepting more would be crossing a line from which she couldn't return. But at the same time, her body screamed for nutrition, for something substantial after days of surviving on water and hope. She placed the menu back on the table, her hands resting in her lap as she struggled to find the right words. "I have no way to pay. I can't accept," she whispered, though every cell in her body begged her to accept. Richard made a dismissive gesture with his hand, as if money were the least of concerns, which for someone of his wealth was probably true. He called the waiter with a gesture, and ordered a complete meal without even consulting Sarah, choosing dishes he knew to be nutritious and substantial. The waiter noted the order and quickly withdrew, clearly relieved that the awkward situation had been resolved. Richard turned his attention to Sarah, studying her with eyes that had learned to read people through years of business. There was something about her that went beyond the obvious desperation, an intelligence and dignity that survived despite the circumstances. He adjusted his position in the wheelchair, the movement causing his inert legs to move slightly. "I'll pay." "Eat," he insisted with gentle firmness that left no room for discussion. When the food arrived, the aroma alone almost made Sarah faint. The plate was artistically arranged, with colors and textures that were a feast for the eyes, even before it was for the stomach. She picked up the fork with hands violently trembling, the first forkful sending an explosion of flavor through her palate, numbed by deprivation. Tears began to stream down her face beyond her control. Each bite was both a relief and a painful reminder of everything she had lost. She tried to eat slowly, with dignity, but hunger won, and soon she was devouring the food with an almost animalistic urgency. Between forkfuls, sobs escaped from her throat, a mixture of gratitude, humiliation, and despair overflowing in tears that dripped onto the expensive plate. "I'm sorry. It's been so long," she tried to explain between bites and tears. Richard observed in respectful silence, not judging, merely witnessing the collapse of someone who had clearly fought beyond her strength. He recognized the type of desperation that Sarah displayed, the kind that comes not from laziness or choice, but from circumstances that crush even the strongest. When she finally slowed down, having consumed half the plate in minutes, he leaned slightly forward, his genuine curiosity overcoming polite discretion. There was something about her that intrigued him, something beyond the obviously desperate situation. Her eyes, even clouded by exhaustion, showed sharp intelligence, and her hands, even trembling, had a care and precision that suggested medical training. "What happened to you?" he asked softly, his voice carrying genuine compassion instead of morbid curiosity. Sarah paused with the fork halfway to her mouth, considering how much she should reveal to this kind stranger. The clock on the restaurant wall showed she had only 20 minutes now, 20 minutes before her mother would be sentenced to death by poverty. She put the fork on the plate and took a deep breath, deciding she had nothing to lose by telling the truth. The words began to flow like a broken dam, the entire story of her rise and fall pouring out in a torrent of revelations. She told about her years of study, about becoming a neurologist, about the passion she had for helping people, about discovering the corruption scheme at the hospital where she worked. "I was a neurologist, one of the best at the hospital, but I made the mistake of doing the right thing," she said with palpable bitterness. The story continued flowing as Sarah explained about the corruption she had discovered, medications being diverted, patients dying for lack of resources that were sold on the black market, administrators lining their pockets while people suffered. She had gathered evidence, had reported to the authorities, had naively believed that the system would work, that justice would prevail. Instead, it was she who paid the price, fired under false accusations, her reputation destroyed, her medical license under constant threat of revocation. Richard listened attentively, his face showing understanding and something more, perhaps admiration for her courage. No hospital would hire her now. She was blacklisted, marked as problematic, as someone who didn't know how to play the game. "I reported the corruption and was destroyed for it. Now I can't get work anywhere," she explained, the injustice still burning in her words. Sarah looked at the clock again, and the panic returned in full force, making her heart race and her hands tremble even more violently. 15 minutes now, just 15 minutes before they would turn off the machines keeping her mother alive. She quickly explained about Margaret, about the heart problem, about that morning's heart attack, about the desperate race to the hospital, about the death sentence by poverty she had received. The words came out jumbled now, urgent, desperate, painting a picture of injustice and despair that was all too familiar in the broken healthcare system. Richard listened with increasingly intense attention, his face changing from understanding to something deeper, something Sarah couldn't identify. "My mother is dying in the hospital. I have little time to get a fortune or they'll turn off the machines," she said, the words coming out like a final confession. It was at this crucial moment that fate decided to intervene in a way neither of them could have predicted. Richard had adjusted his position in the wheelchair while listening to Sarah's story, and his right foot slipped from the special support where it normally stayed positioned. The movement was small, almost imperceptible to any casual observer, but Sarah was not a casual observer. Her doctor's eyes, trained through years of practice and thousands of patients, immediately caught something that made her heart leap. There was a reflex, subtle but definitely present, the kind of involuntary response that indicated that not all was lost in Richard's spinal cord. She leaned forward, her problems momentarily forgotten in the face of this medical discovery. "Sir, there's a patellar reflex. Your injury isn't complete," she exclaimed with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. Richard recoiled as if he had been hit, his face changing from surprise to skepticism and then to a deep bitterness that came from months of destroyed hopes. He had consulted the best specialists in the country, had spent fortunes on exams and consultations, had tried all available experimental treatments, and all had reached the same devastating conclusion: complete and irreversible paralysis. Now this desperate woman, this disgraced doctor who was literally begging for food, was saying that all of them were wrong. Incredulity fought with a small flame of hope that he thought he had completely extinguished. His fingers gripped the arms of the wheelchair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. 10 specialists said it's complete, that there's no hope at all, he replied harshly, protecting himself against yet another disappointment. Sarah recognized the reaction, had seen it many times in patients who had lost hope after multiple negative opinions, but she also knew what she had seen, and her medical certainty was unshakable. She looked at the clock once more, quickly calculating the possibilities, weighing the impossible options before her. A desperate idea began to form in her mind, a proposal so audacious that under normal circumstances it would be considered insane. But these were not normal circumstances, and she had nothing left to lose. She straightened in her chair, meeting Richard's eyes with a determination that transcended her deplorable physical state. It was the last play of a gambler who had lost everything except her ability. "You gave me a plate of food. I can make you walk again in 3 months. I swear on my life," she proposed with a conviction that surprised even herself. Richard studied her for long moments, looking for any sign of charlatanism or irrational desperation in her eyes. But what he saw was professional certainty, the kind of confidence that comes only from true knowledge and experience. There was something else too, something he couldn't define but that intrigued him deeply. He had met many doctors throughout his paralysis journey, but none had demonstrated such absolute certainty, especially after observing only a subtle reflex. The proposal was absurd, but something in him responded to the pure courage of the offer. "I'm Richard, what's your name?" he asked, his voice carrying a strange tone that Sarah couldn't identify. Sarah took a deep breath before answering, feeling she was on the verge of something momentous, although she didn't know exactly what. Her identity had become a curse in recent months, her name synonymous with trouble in the medical field, but she had no choice but to be honest with the man who could be her mother's salvation. The words came out clear and firm, carrying the weight of her history and the urgency of her desperation. "Sarah Coleman," she replied, carefully observing any reaction on his face. The name seemed to mean nothing special to Richard, who continued to observe her with that disturbing intensity. But then he asked the question that would change everything, a seemingly casual question that carried the weight of destiny. His eyes never left her face as he formulated the words, as if sensing that the answer would be more important than anything that had been said until now. "And your mother?" he asked casually, while thinking about the proposal. Sarah looked at the clock once more, seeing the precious minutes slipping away, each second a lost eternity. She didn't understand why he wanted to know about her mother, why it would matter for him to accept or not her desperate proposal. But she answered anyway, the words coming out in a race against time, laden with urgency and desperation. She gestured toward the hospital, as if somehow she could convey the urgency of the situation through the gesture. "Margaret Coleman. She's been dying 20 minutes from here," she said, checking the clock once more. Richard's reaction was instant and devastating. The water glass in his hand fell, shattering on the marble floor with a crash that made everyone in the restaurant turn. His face, which seconds before showed controlled curiosity, was now white as paper, eyes wide in absolute shock. His hands trembled violently as he gripped the arms of the wheelchair, his entire body tense as if he had received an electric shock. The transformation was so dramatic that Sarah instinctively backed away, not understanding what had caused such a reaction. The words that came out of his mouth were almost a shout, laden with raw emotion and disbelief. "Margaret? Did you say your mother's name is Margaret Coleman?" he exclaimed with a voice hoarse with emotion. Before Sarah could process or respond, Richard leaned forward with a desperate urgency, his hands reaching out and gripping her arms with surprising strength. His eyes scanned her face with manic intensity, as if he were seeing ghosts or miracles or perhaps both. She could feel the trembling in his hands, could see the tears beginning to form in his eyes, could sense the weight of some untold story hanging between them. The question he asked next came with a voice trembling with emotion, each word heavy with meaning that Sarah did not yet comprehend. "How old are you?" he asked with desperate urgency. Sarah was completely lost now, not understanding the connection between her age and the situation, but she responded automatically, her mind still trying to process the dramatic shift in events. The number came out almost as a question, her confusion evident in every syllable. 35, she answered, watching Richard's face go through a series of emotions she couldn't decipher. What happened next was an explosion of activity that left everyone in the restaurant gaping. Richard shouted with a voice that carried absolute authority and desperate urgency, causing all the restaurant staff to stop what they were doing. His words were orders fired in rapid succession to his driver, each one more urgent than the last, as if the world would end if they weren't obeyed immediately. "Take us hospital now! Take all the money from the safe!" he shouted to the driver waiting for him on the sidewalk, his voice echoing through the elegant restaurant. Then Richard turned to Sarah with eyes full of tears and an emotion that she finally began to recognize as recognition, as the understanding of something immense and impossible. His hands still held her arms, but now the touch was different, gentler, almost reverent. The words that came out of his mouth next were like an earthquake that destroyed everything Sarah thought she knew about her life. His voice trembled with the weight of revelation, with decades of searching and loss, with the shock of impossible discoveries becoming reality. You might be my daughter," he declared, looking deeply into her eyes. Sarah could hardly believe his words, especially in light of the news that he would pay for her mother's treatment, which she decided was the most important information at the moment. But she decided she would ask Richard more after her mother was saved. She had to be saved. The elegant restaurant transformed into a scene of controlled chaos as Richard began shouting orders in all directions, his voice carrying an urgency that no one had ever witnessed in the normally composed businessman. Thomas, his driver and personal assistant for over a decade, appeared running from the waiting area, his eyes wide with surprise at seeing his boss in such a state of agitation. Restaurant staff ran back and forth, some going to the safe to retrieve all available money as ordered, others preparing the way to the exit. Sarah remained paralyzed in her chair, her brain struggling to process the impossible statement that Richard had made, while the clock continued its relentless march. "Mr. Mitchell, the car is ready." "But what's happening?" asked Thomas as he helped maneuver the wheelchair. Richard wasted no time with explanations, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair firmly as he propelled himself toward the exit, with Sarah being practically dragged along, still in a state of shock. The restaurant manager appeared with a heavy leather bag, clearly full of money, and handed it to Thomas without question, years of loyalty to his best customer making questions unnecessary. Richard's executive car was already waiting at the entrance, the engine running, and the special wheelchair ramp already positioned. Sarah was gently but firmly guided into the vehicle, her mind still spinning with the impossibility of the situation. "To the hospital now, and Thomas, call the bank. I need cash immediately," ordered Richard as the car pulled away. The city streets passed in a blur as Thomas drove with specialized precision, knowing every shortcut and every traffic light in the city, after years of transporting Richard to his appointments. Sarah observed the man beside her, desperately searching for any physical resemblance, any trait that would confirm the absurd claim he had made. Richard, in turn, couldn't take his eyes off her, his face showing a mixture of joy, disbelief, and urgency that made his features almost unrecognizable. "I need to understand what's happening. Why do you think you're my father?" she finally asked, her voice weak from exhaustion. Richard took a deep breath, the sound filling the silence of the waiting room, like a prelude to a story that had waited decades to be told. His hands, normally firm and controlled, trembled slightly as he began to speak, each word carrying the weight of years of searching and regret. He told about a young Richard, son of a wealthy family but not yet corrupted by power, who had fallen hopelessly in love with a young woman named Margaret. She was different from all the women he knew, genuine and warm where others were calculating and cold, hard-working and honest where others were spoiled and superficial. "I loved your mother 36 years ago. We were going to get married. She was everything to me," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. The story continued flowing, Richard painting a picture of young love and promises of a future that Sarah had never imagined. He described the secret meetings, the love letters, the plans to run away together and build a life away from the expectations and pressures of his wealthy family. Margaret had become pregnant, and Richard had been ecstatic at the prospect of being a father, of building a family with the woman he loved. But then, during a business trip that his father had insisted he take, everything changed. When he returned, Margaret had disappeared without a trace, as if she had never existed. "She disappeared while pregnant. I searched for years, hired detectives, offered rewards," explained Richard, his eyes lost in painful memories. Sarah listened to every word with growing attention, pieces of half-heard conversations and strange silences from her mother over the years beginning to make sense. She had always asked about her father, but Margaret always answered the same way, with tears in her eyes and voice trembling with emotion. The story she knew was simple and tragic. Her father had died in an accident before she was born, a good man who would have loved his daughter if he had had the chance. Now, looking at Richard, seeing the genuine pain in his eyes, Sarah began to question everything she thought she knew about her origins. "Mom said you had died, that you died before I was born," she said, silent tears beginning to stream down her face. Richard leaned forward in his chair, the urgency in his voice palpable as he continued his narrative. He explained about the fruitless searches, about the sleepless nights imagining what had happened, about the hole in his life that had never been filled despite his business success and subsequent marriage. His father, the patriarch of the Mitchell family, had said that Margaret was an opportunist, that she had run off with another man when she found someone richer, that the pregnancy was a lie to trap Richard. But he had never believed it. Something in his heart always knew there was more to the story. "My father said she had run away with someone else, but I never believed it. I knew Margaret too well," he insisted with conviction. The hours began to pass slowly as they waited for news of the surgery, each minute an eternity of uncertainty. Sarah and Richard continued talking, sharing details of their lives that began to form a bigger picture. Richard told about his accident, about the paralysis that had destroyed his life as he knew it, about how he had become bitter and isolated. Sarah spoke about her difficult but love-filled childhood, about how Margaret had worked multiple jobs to pay for her education, about the pride in her eyes when Sarah graduated from medical school. Each shared story created more connections, more evidence that the impossible truth might be real. "She always said I had my father's eyes. Now I see the same eyes in the mirror," observed Sarah, studying Richard's face. The television in the waiting room continued its useless programming, but neither of them paid attention. Thomas had positioned himself discreetly near the door, keeping silent guard, while his employer navigated this unexpected emotional reunion. Other family members came and went from the waiting room, some receiving good news, others being destroyed by tragedies, but Sarah and Richard remained in their bubble of revelations and reconnections. Richard showed Sarah old photos that he had learned to put on his phone, images from more than 30 years ago of a young Margaret that he had kept all these years, the smiling face that had haunted his dreams for decades. "I never loved again. Margaret was always the only one," he confessed with brutal honesty. Sarah took the phone with trembling hands, seeing her mother young and radiant, clearly in love, next to a Richard who barely resembled the man in the wheelchair beside her. The photos told a story of happiness she had never known, a prelude to a life that never happened. She could see herself in both faces, traces of Richard she had never noticed in her own reflection, because she had never looked, similarities to Margaret that now seemed to highlight the differences that came from elsewhere. The math was irrefutable. Her age, the time of the disappearance, the stories that didn't align but somehow completed each other. "I always wondered why Mom cried. I thought it was from grief, but now I understand," said Sarah. the pieces of the puzzle finally fitting together. Richard extended his hand hesitantly, as if fearing Sarah might disappear as Margaret had done so many years before. Sarah looked at the outstretched hand, seeing in it not just the gesture of a stranger, but possibly the touch of a father she had spent her entire life wishing for. She took his hand, feeling the warmth and strength, noticing how his fingers were similar to hers, long and skillful, hands of people who worked with precision. The moment was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway, and both turned hopefully toward the door. A nurse rushed past, but not for them, and the disappointment was palpable. 5 hours of surgery. It's normal for the procedure she needs, said Sarah, her medical knowledge offering some comfort. The clock on the wall marked each second with cruel precision, its constant ticking a soundtrack to the anguished wait. Richard told Sarah about his restaurants, about the empire he had built trying to fill the void left by Margaret, about how success had never brought the satisfaction he expected. Sarah spoke about her medical career, about her passion for neurology, about how she always felt she was trying to prove something to someone, perhaps to the father she thought was dead. They discovered surprising similarities. Both were perfectionists. Both had the same way of furrowing their brow when concentrated. Both couldn't stand injustice. I was always told I was too stubborn for my own good. Now I know where it comes from, commented Sarah with a small smile. Thomas occasionally brought coffee and water, silently tending to the needs of his employer and the woman who could be his daughter. He had worked for Richard long enough to know about Margaret, about the fruitless searches, about the melancholy that never completely left his employer's eyes. Seeing this possible reunion, this chance for redemption and reconnection clearly moved him as well. Afternoon turned into evening, the windows of the waiting room showing the illuminated city beyond, a world that kept spinning oblivious to the drama unfolding in that small space. "Mr. Mitchell, I brought some sandwiches. You need to eat something," said Thomas gently, placing the food on the center table. Sarah ate a few pieces, knowing she would need strength for what came next. Richard merely sipped his coffee, his eyes constantly returning to the double doors of the surgical center. They had spent the last few hours reconstructing decades of history, trying to understand how their lives had been separated, and now miraculously reunited. Sarah told about the financial difficulties, about how Margaret never accepted charity, always insisting that they would manage on their own. Richard talked about the guilt he carried, about how he always felt he had failed Margaret somehow. "If I had insisted more, if I had confronted my father earlier," he lamented, regret weighing in every word. The medical team occasionally passed through the waiting room, but no one stopped to give updates, which Sarah knew to be both a good and bad sign. Complex cardiac surgeries like the one Margaret was undergoing required total concentration, and no news usually meant that everything was progressing as expected. She tried to explain this to Richard, using lay terms to describe the procedure, the saphenous vein bypasses being constructed, the heart being temporarily stopped while a machine took over its functions. Richard listened attentively, clearly impressed with Sarah's knowledge, paternal pride shining in his eyes. "You're brilliant, just as your mother always said you would be," he said, the words escaping before he could contain them. Sarah felt a wave of emotion with those words, the recognition she had desired her whole life, coming from a man who until hours ago was a complete stranger. She looked at their intertwined hands, his and hers, and saw the truth that paternity tests would only confirm. There was a connection here that transcended genetics, a recognition of souls that had been separated but never truly disconnected. Richard began talking about the future, about everything he wanted to do for Sarah, about how he would make up for the lost years. But she gently interrupted him. "First, let's save Mum, then we'll think about the rest," she said with wisdom beyond her circumstances. The 5 hours of surgery seemed to last 5 days, each minute dragging with torturous slowness. Other patients were operated on and released while they waited. Other families received their news and departed, but Sarah and Richard remained in their vigil. Thomas had dozed off in the chair near the door, but woke instantly whenever someone approached. Exhaustion weighed on Sarah like a lead blanket, days without proper sleep finally taking their toll, but she refused to close her eyes, afraid of missing the moment when news would arrive. "You should rest a bit. I'll wake you when the doctor comes," Richard offered, but Sarah shook her head. Finally, when the clock was approaching midnight, the double doors of the surgical center opened with a pneumatic hiss that made all three of them jump to attention. The surgeon appeared, still wearing his surgical clothes, the mask hanging around his neck, and signs of fatigue evident on his face. But there was something else there, something Sarah immediately recognized and that made her heart leap with hope. It was the look of deep professional satisfaction, the kind of expression doctors have when they know they've done good work, when they know they've saved a life. He walked toward them with tired but confident steps, his words preceded by a smile that said everything before he even spoke. "Complete success. She's going to live," he announced with evident satisfaction in his voice. Sarah felt her legs give way with the relief that flooded her body upon hearing those magical words from the surgeon. Richard immediately extended his arms to support her, and she let herself fall against the support of his wheelchair, sobs of joy and exhaustion escaping from her throat as all the tension of the past few days finally found a release valve. The doctor continued explaining the details of the surgery, how they had managed to perform 5 coronary bypasses, how Margaret's heart had responded well to the procedure, how the next few days would be critical but promising. Thomas discreetly wiped away a tear, moved by witnessing that moment of joy after so much anguish. "When can we see her?" asked Sarah, her voice choked with emotion. The surgeon explained that Margaret was being transferred to the intensive care unit, where she would remain sedated for the next few hours to allow her body to recover from the trauma of surgery. He guided them through the hospital corridors, now strangely silent in the early hours, with only the distant sound of monitors and the occasional whisper of the night staff. Richard navigated his wheelchair with renewed determination, as if the good news had given him extra strength. Sarah walked beside him, her hands trembling with anticipation and relief, each step bringing her closer to confirming with her own eyes that her mother had survived. "She's strong like you, she'll overcome this," said Richard, his voice filled with admiration for both women. The intensive care unit was different from the chaos of the emergency room, more controlled and organized, with each patient in cubicles separated by curtains or glass partitions. The constant sound of machines created a mechanical symphony of life, each beep and hiss representing a vital function being monitored and maintained. Sarah immediately recognized Margaret's cubicle by the cluster of equipment around the bed, from the mechanical ventilator to the multiple infusion pumps administering medications. Through the glass, she could see her mother lying in the hospital bed, looking small and fragile, surrounded by so much technology. "Mom," whispered Sarah, her hand touching the glass as if she could pass through it. The nurse responsible for the night shift greeted them with gentle professionalism, explaining that they could enter for a few minutes, but should remain calm and avoid touching any equipment. Sarah entered first, her steps hesitant as if fearing that any sudden movement might break the spell keeping her mother alive. Richard had more difficulty with the wheelchair in the tight space, but Thomas helped him position himself next to the bed. Margaret was connected to so many wires and tubes that it was difficult to see where technology ended, and she began. But Sarah focused on what mattered, the constant rising and falling of her chest, irrefutable proof that she was alive. "I'm here, Mum, you made it, you're a warrior," said Sarah, gently holding Margaret's hand. Richard watched the scene with tearful eyes, seeing Margaret for the first time in 36 years, even though unconscious and vulnerable. She had aged, of course, but he could still see the woman he had loved in every line of her face, in every strand of now grey hair that once was black as night. His hands trembled with the desire to touch her, to confirm that she was real, and not just another of the dreams that had tormented him for decades. Sarah noticed his conflict and gently took his hand, guiding it to Margaret's free hand, creating a physical connection between the three for the first time. "She will want to see you when she wakes up," said Sarah, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. The following hours passed in a silent vigil, with Sarah and Richard taking turns at the bedside while Margaret remained sedated. Thomas had gone to get coffee and some snacks, insisting they needed to keep up their strength. The nighttime hospital had its own rhythm, slower but no less intense, with occasional emergencies breaking the quietness. Sarah took the time to observe Richard more carefully, noticing small gestures and mannerisms that she recognized in herself, subtle confirmations of the connection they both already knew existed. Richard, for his part, couldn't stop looking between Sarah and Margaret, amazed at the family he had found when he least expected it. "I spent years looking for you in all the wrong places," he muttered, more to himself. When the sun began to rise, painting the sky beyond the hospital windows in shades of orange and pink, Margaret began to show signs of awakening. Small movements of her fingers first, then her eyelids fluttering like butterflies trying to fly. Sarah immediately called the nurse, who checked her vital signs and confirmed that everything was progressing as expected. Richard moved his chair closer, his eyes fixed on Margaret's face, as if fearing she might disappear again if he blinked. Sarah held her mother's hand more firmly, murmuring words of encouragement and love. "Wake up slowly, Mum. We're here waiting for you," she said softly. Margaret's eyes finally opened, unfocused at first from the sedation and the trauma of surgery. Sarah leaned in to enter her field of vision, smiling through tears she could no longer contain. Margaret blinked several times, her brain struggling to process where she was and what had happened. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out due to the breathing tube, causing a moment of panic that Sarah quickly calmed. The nurse explained that the tube would be removed soon, once they were sure she could breathe adequately on her own. "You're okay, Mom. The surgery was a success," explained Sarah, gently squeezing her hand. It was then that Margaret turned her head slightly and saw Richard. Her eyes widened in shock and disbelief, tears immediately beginning to stream down the sides of her face. She tried to speak again, frustrated by the tube that prevented her, her hands weakly agitating. Richard leaned forward as much as his chair allowed, his own tears falling freely now. Years of searching, of dreams, of regrets, all culminating in this moment of mutual recognition. Sarah observed the silent exchange between her parents, seeing decades of untold history pass between them in seconds. "Yes, Mom. It's him. Richard is here," confirmed Sarah, her voice breaking with emotion. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of gradual recovery and emotional revelations. Margaret improved each day, gaining strength and mental clarity as her repaired heart learned its new rhythm. Richard had arranged for her to be transferred to a private room as soon as possible, a spacious and comfortable area that seemed more like a luxury hotel room than a hospital room. Sarah practically lived there, dividing her time between caring for her mother and beginning to know her father. Richard came every day, Thomas faithfully bringing him in the morning and picking him up only late at night. "This place is too luxurious for us," protested Margaret when she was conscious enough to notice. The private room had large windows that offered a view of the city, letting in natural light that Margaret said was good for her soul. There was a sofa bed where Sarah slept, a comfortable armchair where Richard spent his hours, and enough space for Thomas when he accompanied them. Fresh flowers arrived daily by Richard's order, filling the environment with fragrances that masked the hospital smell. Margaret initially resisted so much luxury, her pride struggling against accepting what she saw as charity, but Sarah gently reminded her that Richard had the right to take care of them after so many lost years. "Let him do this, Mom. He needs it as much as we do," Sarah argued. During these 2 weeks, the complete story finally emerged in pieces, like a puzzle being assembled one painful piece at a time. Margaret was strong enough now to speak for longer periods, although Sarah still carefully monitored her vital signs. On a particularly emotional afternoon, with the sun coming through the windows and creating patterns of light on the floor, Margaret finally gathered the courage to tell the complete truth. Richard had positioned his chair very close to the bed, and Sarah sat on the other side, the three forming an intimate triangle of family reunited. "I need to tell you everything. You both deserve to know the truth," Margaret began, her voice still weak but determined. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, clearly gathering strength to revisit memories she had buried for decades. When she opened them again, there was an iron determination in them, the same that Sarah had inherited. She began to tell about the day everything changed, when Richard was traveling and his father, Don Charles Mitchell, had appeared at her door. He didn't come alone. He brought 2 large and intimidating men and an envelope full of photographs. The photos showed her family, her elderly mother, her younger siblings, even her small nephews, taken from distances that made it clear they were being watched. "Richard, your father threatened me, said he would destroy my family," Margaret revealed, the words coming out broken by emotion. Richard turned livid hearing the details, his fists clenching so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Margaret continued, describing how Don Charles had been meticulous in his threats, explaining exactly how each member of her family could suffer an accident if she didn't disappear. He offered money, an amount that seemed like a fortune to someone of humble origins like her, but made it clear that the money was less a bribe and more an advance funeral payment if she refused. Margaret was 3 months pregnant, starting to show, and Don Charles was especially cruel about it. He showed photos, knew where we lived, where my siblings worked, where the children studied, Margaret continued, tears streaming down. Sarah held her mother's hand as she listened, her heart breaking, imagining the terror Margaret must have felt, alone and pregnant, being threatened by one of the most powerful men in the city. Richard was clearly devastated, each revelation a stab to his soul. He had idolized his father when young, even knowing he could be harsh in business. Discovering that Don Charles had been capable of such cruelty, that he had destroyed his happiness out of prejudice and pride, was almost unbearable. Margaret explained how she had fled that same night, taking only the essentials and the money Don Charles had left. "I fled to protect everyone. Sarah is your daughter, Richard," she confirmed, looking directly into his eyes. The final confirmation, although already expected, still hit Richard like lightning. He looked at Sarah, his daughter, the brilliant doctor who had grown up without him, who had fought and achieved everything without the support he could have given. The weight of 36 years lost fell on his shoulders like a mountain. Sarah saw the moment when guilt threatened to engulf him and quickly intervened, moving to hug him for the first time. It was an awkward hug due to the wheelchair, but loaded with meaning and forgiveness. Richard broke down completely, sobbing against his daughter's shoulder as years of pain and regret flowed. "Forgive your father, Sarah, he didn't know," Margaret gently asked. Richard composed himself enough to reach for a backpack that Thomas had brought days before, but that he hadn't had the courage to open until now. With trembling hands, he took out a worn wooden box, clearly old and much handled. Upon opening it, he revealed its contents. Dozens of private detective photographs, search reports, newspaper clippings about missing persons, receipts for rewards offered, maps with circled areas where he had searched. It was an obsessive file of a search that had consumed years of his life. "I looked for you until the day of my accident. I never gave up," he said, showing each document as evidence of his devotion. Sarah and Margaret examined the documents with growing astonishment. There were detective reports from 5 different countries, records of Richard traveling to distant cities following false leads, letters to authorities begging for help. One photo in particular caught Sarah's attention. It was Richard in front of an orphanage, clearly looking for a child who could be his. The date on the photo was from her 5th birthday. He had been looking for her on the exact day she was blowing candles on a simple cake that Margaret had made with her savings. "You really never gave up," Sarah murmured, touched beyond words. Margaret extended her hand to Richard, and he took it as if it were a lifeline. For long moments they just looked at each other, decades of unexpressed love, unshared pain, and mutual regret passing between them in silence. Sarah observed her parents, seeing the love that still existed despite everything, burning beneath the ashes of lost years. It was she who broke the silence, her practical doctor's voice cutting through the emotion. Richard and Margaret turned to her, and there was something new on her face, determination mixed with joy. "We lost so much time, but you're here now, we're here," said Sarah, embracing both parents at the same time. The moment was interrupted by Sarah abruptly standing up, her doctor mode taking over. She had made a promise at the restaurant, a promise born of desperation, but that now became a mission. Richard watched her with curiosity as she began examining his legs, her professional fingers searching for specific points, testing reflexes that other doctors had declared absent. Margaret watched with interest, well familiar with her daughter's look of concentration. Sarah worked in silence for several minutes, occasionally muttering to herself, making mental notes. "Now let's fulfill my promise. I'm going to make you walk, Dad," she declared with confidence that surprised everyone. Richard began to protest that it wasn't necessary, that finding Sarah and Margaret was miracle enough, but Sarah wasn't listening. She was already in full doctor mode, instructing Thomas to help transfer Richard from the chair to the extra hospital bed in the room. Margaret watched with a small smile, recognizing the determination she had seen in Sarah since childhood, the same stubbornness that had carried her through medical school despite all difficulties. Sarah explained that she would do a complete assessment first, that she needed to understand exactly where the damage was and where there was preservation. "Trust me, Dad, I know what I'm doing," she said with professional authority. The first session began right there in the private room, with Sarah improvising with what she had available. She started with manual stimulation, her fingers finding nerve points that had been ignored by other doctors. Richard initially felt nothing, but Sarah persisted, adjusting the pressure and angle, looking for any response. Margaret offered silent encouragement, her presence a stabilizing force for both. After 30 minutes of careful work, Richard suddenly gasped. He had felt something, faint as a feather, but definitely a sensation where nothing had existed for months. "I felt it. It was quick, but I felt something," he exclaimed with amazement. Sarah smiled, but didn't stop her work. She began applying specific techniques she had learned during her specialization, combining Western knowledge with Eastern techniques she had studied on her own. Her hands worked with surgical precision, stimulating points that corresponded to specific nerve pathways. Richard began to sweat with the effort of concentrating on the sensations, trying to connect his mind with parts of his body that had been silent for so long. Margaret took his free hand, offering silent support. "Breathe deeply and try to visualize energy flowing to your legs," Sarah instructed. The session extended for 2 intense hours, with Sarah working tirelessly while explaining each step to keep Richard involved and hopeful. She talked about neuroplasticity, about how the brain could create new pathways, about cases she had studied where injuries considered complete had shown partial recovery. Thomas watched everything from the door, clearly moved by the possibility of his employer being able to walk again. Margaret occasionally offered water to both, maternal even in her fragile condition. "Medicine evolves every day, Dad. What was impossible yesterday may be possible today," Sarah explained as she worked. The crucial moment came when Sarah asked Richard to try something that dozens of doctors had tried without success. She had spent the last 2 hours preparing the nerve pathways, stimulating connections that were dormant but not dead. Now was the moment of truth. She positioned her hand on Richard's right big toe, applying light pressure as a reference. The room fell into absolute silence, even Margaret holding her breath in anticipation. "Now try to move your right big toe," Sarah instructed, with a voice calm but laden with hope. Richard closed his eyes, every fiber of his being focused on that single command. He visualized the movement, imagined the energy flowing from his brain through the spinal cord to his foot. For long seconds, nothing happened. Sarah kept her hand in place, murmuring encouragement. Margaret squeezed his hand tighter. Thomas stepped into the room, unable to stay away from this crucial moment. And then, miraculously, impossibly, the toe moved. It was a tiny movement, almost imperceptible but definitely real. The toe moved, confirming what Sarah had suspected. The injury wasn't complete. Everyone in the room erupted in exclamations of joy. Richard opened his eyes, tears flowing freely down his face as he looked at his foot in absolute amazement. He tried again, and the toe responded once more, a little stronger this time. Sarah was crying and laughing at the same time, relief and joy overflowing after the tension of the past hours. Margaret was openly sobbing, her hands covering her mouth in astonishment. Thomas had abandoned all pretense of professionalism and was clapping like a child. The moment was pure magic, pure joy, pure hope, crystallized in a single tiny movement. "It's a miracle," exclaimed Richard, looking between his foot and Sarah with admiration. Sarah held Richard's hands in hers, her face shining with tears of joy and renewed determination. She looked into his eyes, seeing not just her patient, but her father, the man who had searched for her throughout his life, who had never given up even when it seemed impossible. Her words came out with professional certainty, tempered with filial love, a promise that transcended medicine and touched the realm of the sacred. The work would be long and difficult. There would be days of frustration and pain, but she had no doubts about the final outcome. "It's not a miracle, it's science and love. 3 months, and you'll be dancing at my wedding." "Someday," she said with a smile that lit up the room. Margaret rose from the bed with effort, still weak but moved by the emotion of the moment. She walked the few steps to where Richard was lying and Sarah was sitting, and wrapped both in her arms. It was an awkward hug, hindered by position and medical equipment, but it was perfect in its imperfection. Three people who should have been family from the beginning finally united after decades of separation. Tears mingled, breaths synchronized, hearts beat in a shared rhythm of rediscovered love and renewed hope. "My family, finally complete," declared Margaret, her voice carrying decades of waiting and the joy of a dream finally realized. 3 months had passed since that magical moment in the hospital. 3 months of hard work, dedication and love transformed into daily progress. The Mitchell Gold restaurant shone under the golden evening lights, its windows reflecting the setting sun that painted the sky in shades of orange and red. Sarah and Margaret were already seated at a special table near the window, the same table where everything had begun, where fate had reunited a family separated by decades of lies and threats. Margaret wore an elegant blue dress that Richard had insisted on buying for her, her hair arranged in a graceful bun that made her look years younger. Sarah wore a green dress that enhanced her eyes, her hands occasionally going to the pearl necklace her father had given her the previous month. "He's late. Did something happen?" Margaret asked nervously, looking at the entrance. Sarah held her mother's hand on the table, a comforting gesture that had become natural between them in recent months. The transformation in their lives had been complete and overwhelming, moving from poverty and despair to security and happiness that sometimes still seemed surreal. The restaurant was specially decorated for the occasion, with fresh flowers on each table and an atmosphere of celebration hanging in the air. The waiters, the same ones who had witnessed the first dramatic meeting, now smiled warmly at them, having followed the entire journey of the Mitchell family. Thomas had called minutes earlier confirming they were on their way, but Sarah could see her mother's anxiety growing with each second. "He'll arrive, Mum. Today is too special a day for him to miss," Sarah reassured. It was then that the restaurant doors opened and a reverent silence took over the environment. Richard Mitchell walked in, not with crutches, not with a walker, not with anyone's help, but walking perfectly on his own legs. Each step was firm and confident, his posture erect and proud, wearing an impeccable suit that emphasized his complete recovery. The restaurant customers, many of whom knew his story, began to spontaneously applaud, some with tears in their eyes as they witnessed what many called a miracle. Richard paused for a moment at the entrance, his eyes searching for and finding Sarah and Margaret, a radiant smile lighting up his face. "Sorry I'm late. I wanted to walk all the way from the car," he said, as he approached the table. Sarah stood up first, tears already streaming down her face as she watched her father walk toward her with the grace and ease of someone who had never lost that ability. 3 months of intense daily sessions, painful exercises, small victories and occasional setbacks, all culminating in this moment of absolute triumph. Margaret also stood up, her hands covering her mouth in emotion as she watched the man she loved walking. Richard reached them and wrapped them in a long, tight embrace, the kind of hug that communicated more than words ever could. "We did it, my darlings. We did it together," he murmured against their hair. The embrace lasted for long moments, none of them wanting to be the first to break the physical contact that still seemed precious and fragile after so many lost years. Other restaurant customers observed the scene with moved smiles, some knowing the story, others just intuiting the importance of the moment. When they finally separated, Richard pulled out chairs for both women with the gallantry he had recovered along with his mobility, then sat down himself with fluid movements that still amazed Sarah. He took both their hands on the table, creating a circle of connection, his eyes shining with undisguised emotion. "You gave me everything back. My legs, my family, my life," he said, his voice choked with gratitude. Sarah squeezed her father's hand, feeling the warmth and strength that had become so familiar in recent months. She thought about all the mornings waking up early for physical therapy sessions, all the nights studying new techniques, all the dedication she had put in not just as a doctor, but as a daughter determined to give her father what he deserved. Progress had been slow at first, each small movement a hard-won victory. But Richard had been a determined patient, never complaining even when the pain was evident on his face. Margaret had been there for every session, offering encouragement and love. The family finally united, working toward a common goal. "You saved us too, Dad. Mum is alive because of you," Sarah replied, remembering that terrible day at the hospital. In the previous months, the family couldn't have been happier, all completely recovered and, most importantly, united. Sarah had been readmitted to the hospital with a formal apology and a prominent position in the neurology department. The corrupt hospital management had been fired, and the hospital was now a reference in empathy and patient care. Margaret had flourished with proper medical care and the love of the reunited family. "Life has given us a second chance and we won't waste it," declared Richard as he paid the bill. It was in this moment of family contentment that fate decided to echo the past in a poignant way. A small girl, no more than 10 years old, approached the table hesitantly. Her clothes were clean but clearly worn, her large eyes showing the same mixture of pride and desperation that Sarah had carried a year before. She stopped a few steps away, clearly gathering courage to speak, her small hands nervously twisting the hem of her threadbare blouse. The whole family turned to look at her, and Sarah felt her heart tighten as she recognized her own story about to repeat itself. "Excuse me, can I have the leftovers?" asked the girl in a small but determined voice. Sarah immediately stood up and walked to the girl with the grace of someone who deeply understood that moment. She carefully crouched down, coming to the child's eye level, her hands gently touching the small shoulders. There was something in the girl's eyes that went beyond physical hunger, a need for dignity and recognition that Sarah knew intimately. The girl tried to back away, clearly embarrassed now that she had someone's full attention, but Sarah gently kept her in place. "What's your name?" Sarah asked in a soft, welcoming voice. The girl hesitated for a moment, clearly debating whether she should trust this elegant stranger who showed such kindness. When she finally answered, her voice was almost a whisper, but carried a strength that contradicted her fragile appearance. Sarah smiled warmly, recognizing the courage it took for a child to ask for help, especially in a place as intimidating as a luxury restaurant. She rose and extended her hand to the girl, who took it hesitantly. "Emily," the girl answered, her eyes widening in surprise at the gesture. Sarah guided Emily to the family table, pulling up an extra chair and positioning it between herself and Margaret. The girl sat cautiously, clearly overwhelmed by the situation, but also too hungry to refuse. Richard was already signaling to the waiter, his eyes shining with complete understanding of the moment and its significance. Margaret immediately began chatting with the girl, her maternal voice calming the child's obvious nerves. "Emily, sit with us. Let's have dinner together," said Sarah, making the girl settle in. Richard addressed the waiter with gentle authority, ensuring that his voice carried not just across the restaurant, but also to the heart of their small guest. He had learned in recent months that true wealth wasn't in the money he possessed, but in the ability to transform lives, to offer dignity where there was humiliation, hope where there was despair. The waiter, the same one who had witnessed Sarah's transformation, smiled understandingly and noted the order. Emily watched everything with wide eyes, clearly never having experienced such treatment in her young life. "Serve the best dish for our guest," Richard ordered with a warm smile. When the food arrived, presented with the same elegance and care that would be given to any paying customer, Emily looked at the plate as if it were a dream materialized. Sarah gently encouraged her to eat, remembering her own desperate hunger, and how Richard had shown the same kindness. The girl began eating slowly at first, then with more enthusiasm when she realized no one would take the food away from her. Between bites, she began to relax, even smiling when Margaret made a gentle joke. The whole family watched with warm smiles, seeing not charity, but human sharing in its purest form. "Is it tasty, Emily?" Margaret asked maternally. The statement was met with a moment of stunned silence, followed by applause that started slow and grew until it became an ovation. Richard continued, explaining that it wouldn't be charity but sharing, that each meal would be served with the same quality and dignity as any other. He looked at Sarah as he spoke, his eyes shining with pride and gratitude for the daughter who had completely changed his perspective on life. The words flowed from his heart, each one carrying the weight of his personal transformation. "Because my daughter taught me that hunger isn't just for food, it's for dignity, for love, for family," he finished, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah stood up, her movement graceful. Her words were simple, but laden with deep meaning. "From leftovers, our story was born," she said, her voice carrying the weight of her entire journey. Richard held his daughter's face between his hands, a paternal gesture he had dreamed of making for decades without knowing. His eyes scanned her features, seeing Margaret in them, seeing himself, seeing the miracle of a second chance that few receive in life. His response came from the depths of his soul, laden with admiration, gratitude, and unconditional love. The truth of his words resonated not just for Sarah, but for all who witnessed the moment. "And what a beautiful story was born," he replied, his voice full of wonder. "Now tell me in the comments where you're from and tell me, did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and check out the next one waiting for you here on the screen. See you there.